Well, distinguished guests, Parliamentary Secretary Brown, President Albright of GPE, David Morley of UNICEF Canada, Sharif Ghalib of the Embassy of Afghanistan, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate for this afternoon's session on education at the margins, reaching children in fragile and conflict-affected states. A special welcome to our global webcast audience as well for today's event. This building, the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate, was opened in 2008, and when His Highness the Aga Khan and the Prime Minister opened this building, they expressed a joint aspiration that we use this space to lift our aspirations for what Canada might contribute to making the world a more peaceful, pluralist, and prosperous place. And so as part of that mandate, Aga Khan Foundation Canada has the great privilege of bringing people together on topics of critical importance to the world. We take a special privilege in creating opportunities for people who are visiting Ottawa, development leaders who happen to be in Ottawa as part of their duties, to give them a platform to address us. Just weeks ago, I saw Mary Fowler here somewhere. Just weeks ago, we had Elizabeth Rasmussen from the World Food Program, who was in Canada and came and gave us an extraordinary address about the work that the World Food Program is embarking on. And today we have Alice Albright, who is the president of the Global Partnership for Education, a very important multilateral development institution. She is in Ottawa, and we're very delighted that she has made time to share with us some of her thoughts and for giving us the occasion to bring together a bunch of other people to have a conversation about this important topic. Now, some of you may know today's a very important day for the Aga Khan Development Network. His Highness the Aga Khan was in Ottawa earlier today to address the Parliament of Canada. Those of you who heard the speech will recall that one of the sentiments he expressed was how deeply held the conviction about education is in our system. That education has the great transformative potential. And when it comes to the issue of education in fragile and conflict states, the Aga Khan Development Network has a particular commitment. In these situations, education can be a very, very important force. It's a driver for allowing people to begin to create economic livelihoods, which are very important in these contexts. It's a driver to allow people to move from a situation of despair to a situation of hope, another very important ingredient of success in these fragile environments. It is a driver of creating a new sense of mindsets about living together, creating forces for pluralism, for peace, for the support of civil society. It is a driver when designed purposefully to include girls and women, to create opportunities and platforms for women and girls to take their rightful place in these societies. Therefore, we believe firmly that education is transformative in all contexts, but in fragile settings, in conflict-affected regions, it's of especial importance. It is especially transformative early on in the suite of things that an international response might support in fragile settings. The Aga Khan Development Network is active in many parts of Asia and Africa. In fact, I want to welcome here a colleague of mine who is visiting, Nimet Rayner, who runs the Aga Khan Education Services globally and is responsible for hundreds of schools in Africa and Asia. We have been active in fragile places like Afghanistan, post-conflict places like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, continue to be active throughout Eastern Africa. In all these places, often in collaboration with Canada, we have taken it as a set of important principles that access to education is important and quality of education is essential. That the hardware of education is very important, but that the software of education is absolutely instrumental to achieving quality and to sustaining gains in access. Thinking hard about curriculum, thinking hard about teacher training and teacher quality and support to teachers, thinking hard about school leadership and system leadership. What are the qualities of educational leadership that allows systems to transform from low-performing to high-performing in a systematic way. And then what are the partnerships? What are the partnerships that one can architect between developed world institutions and developing world institutions that allow both to transform and improve their practice? So these are essential principles. We're very grateful for the ongoing support of the Department for Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development for this event, but also for decades of collaboration on education, which for us, as I've said, is central to so much of what we do. So today, we are very happy to be able to provide a platform for a conversation on these important issues with some very thoughtful people, whom I will introduce in a second. But before I do that, I'm very pleased that Parliamentary Secretary for International Development, Lois Brown, has agreed to accept our invitation to offer the welcome address for this forum. It's appropriate because those of you who have met Ms. Brown will know that the level of energy and conviction that she has brought to development issues in general is extraordinary, but her passion for education is singular. So we are delighted, Lois, that you have taken time out of your busy schedule to share with us some of your thoughts, your convictions, and your energy on this issue. Ladies and gentlemen, Lois Brown.
Well, thank you, Khalil, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to be here today on behalf of Minister Paradis. He sends his deep regrets that he is not able to join you. I did have a conversation with him after his luncheon with His Highness the Aga Khan, and he says that they had a very, very robust conversation. He knows that this is a work in progress, and he looks forward to working with the Aga Khan Foundation in the future. Special thanks also to the Aga Khan Foundation Canada and Global Partnership for Education, two of our biggest partners in education, for co-hosting this event today. I'd also like to point out that we do have with us Diane Jacovella, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Global Issues and Development, and you are going to hear from her because she's going to be moderating the panel today. Developing countries have made significant progress toward achieving universal primary education. However, fragile states affected by conflict lag far behind other countries, and their children are paying the price. Securing the future of children and youth is one of Canada's development priorities. We see education as a way to foster peace and security, and to help stimulate economic growth and to reduce poverty. Nowhere is that more true or more crucial than in fragile states. Education for children is a basic building block that we cannot afford to ignore. Canada has a long-standing commitment to the Millennium Development Goal to ensure that by 2015, boys and girls alike will be able to complete their primary schooling. Our development programs have a particular focus on supporting access to quality basic education and safe and secure schools. We also want to ensure that children and youth who are living in emergency situations because of disasters and conflict have access to the services they need, including education. That's why Canada supports education in fragile states through its Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, which is the lead international network in this field. This network brings together key stakeholders to help countries transition from humanitarian assistance to development aid in education, among other goals. It also allows long-term partners to compare their experiences, find new ways to work together, and to learn from each other's innovative best practices. Earlier today, our Parliament had the honour to be addressed by His Highness the Aga Khan. Prime Minister Harper and His Highness signed a protocol of understanding, committing both to regular, high-level consultations on a range of global and regional issues. The protocol further consolidates the cooperative relationship we have through the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development and the Aga Khan Foundation in Canada. We are very excited about this potential that this holds for a variety of global issues, including the promise it holds for better learning outcomes for children and youth. Of course, we already have a number of educational projects on which we are collaborating. In Afghanistan, for example, our girls' education program covers the full continuum of education, from early childhood development programs to supporting women in teacher training college. Canada has been among the top donors to Afghanistan, and education remains one of Canada's largest investments in the country. In Afghanistan, it accounts for 25% of our development budget. Our efforts have paid dividends. Our education investments have led to a dramatic increase in the number of girls enrolled in schools across Afghanistan. In 2001, less than 1 million children were enrolled in formal schools, and all of them were boys. But by 2013, 9.7 million children were enrolled in schools, and 40% of them are girls. Looking at today's topic, education at the margins, reaching children in fragile and conflict-affected areas, it is clear that success is based on working with experienced and knowledgeable partners like you here today. Canada is also proud to be partners with the Global Partnership for Education, which works in 28 developing fragile states. The Global Partnership helps to develop interim education plans in fragile states. This is a key step to offering children who are the most difficult to reach the opportunity to learn and develop. Working through local partners, the Global Partnership is having a transformative effect on the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. DRC recently developed the first interim education plan in more than a generation. The Global Partnership is also helping to accelerate education funding to countries considered extremely fragile, such as Somalia and the Central African Republic, where grants support teachers, children, and school councils. Canada has learned from progress in the G8 Muskoka Initiative for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health, which is our government's top development priority. We are effective when global will gets behind an idea, in this case to save the lives of women and children and improve their health. Now, we have an opportunity to focus attention around the refugee and displaced children of Syria. On January the 7th, the United Nations Children's Fund, the UN Refugee Agency, Save the Children, World Vision, and other NGO partners launched the No Lost Generation initiative. It calls for governments, aid agencies, and the general public to champion the children of Syria. Since conflict erupted in Syria in March of 2011, it is estimated that 140,000 people have been killed, and more than 8 million people have been driven from their homes. And half of those people are children. I am moved by the goal of this initiative to provide Syrian children with the protective environment and learning opportunities they need to reclaim their childhood. The vast majority, 1 million children, live in the surrounding countries of Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, and Iraq. Nearly 8,000 of them are separated from their immediate families. And since this situation is even more dire for the more than 3 million displaced children who are living inside Syria, On January the 24th, the Prime Minister announced an additional $50 million in humanitarian funding for education and child protection activities that support the No Lost Generation initiative. We expect that through our partners, we will be able to restore hope for 660,000 children by protecting them and giving them an education. The Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development is working closely with UNICEF and NGO partners to ensure a coordinated approach between humanitarian and development activities in support of emergency education in Lebanon and Jordan. I understand that today's panel will explore how commitments from civil society, governments and multilateral institutions can best reach children in fragile and conflict-afflicted areas. Canada's role in supporting the No Lost Generation initiative will no doubt be part of that discussion as we look for new ways to align our efforts. I do want to tell you, however, a very personal story that is not written in my notes, but this comes from my heart, because I understand the desperate need for education in emerging economies. I'd like to tell you the story about a young man named Kofi Asante, who came to Canada. Actually, he came with a master's degree from Ghana, but was promoted as a young man of great potential, and they wanted to see him have the opportunity to further his education. Kofi came to Laurentian University in Ontario. For those of you who don't know Ontario well, it's north of Toronto by about 200 miles, so a very cold area of our province. Kofi came to do a second master's degree in nanotechnologies because the work that he had done in physics was, first of all, very applicable to the mining industry in Ghana. While at Laurentian University, Kofi met and fell in love with a young lady by the name of Shannon. And Kofi went on to do his PhD in electrical engineering at a university in the United States. Shannon accomplished her master's degree in education in Australia, came back, and it was very evident that there was a romance blossoming. So where are Kofi and Shannon now? Well, Kofi is back in Ghana. He is the guest professor at the University of Mining and Technology in Takwa, Ghana, and his bride, Shannon, is teaching grades 4 to 6 English. And how do I know this? Because Kofi is my son-in-law. Africa is my family. And so I understand the reason why we need to take education to the world. I know you have great expertise, and I know that you have a great passion for these initiatives. This issue is dear to your heart. So thank you so very much for what you are undertaking. Thank you for your contributions, for your passion, and I sincerely look forward to the discussion that the panel is going to bring to you today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Brown. That was inspiring, as expected. So thank you. That's excellent. I will now ask the panel to take their seats on stage. I have been told that you are all given their bios on your seats, so I will not recite them in any detail. In any case, they're all too distinguished for me to summarize it with any pith here. But I will tell you that we are welcoming Alice Albright, who is the Chief Executive Officer for the Global Partnership for Education. David Morley, known, I think, to many of you in this room as one of the most important leaders in the development sector in Canada, currently is President and CEO of UNICEF Canada, and Mr. Sharif Ghalib from the Embassy of Afghanistan in Canada, which we're very delighted to have. We unfortunately have had to send the regrets on behalf of the Afghan Minister of Education, Minister Wardak, who was called back to Kabul, or was unable to travel to North America as planned because of some pressing cabinet responsibilities. But those of you who have met Mr. Ghalib will know that he's going to be ably represented here by Mr. Ghalib. They will be moderated deftly, I can assure you, by Diane Jacovella, the Assistant Deputy Minister at the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development. And this is not the first time that Diane has moderated on this stage, and I can tell you, you're in for a treat. So with that, I will hand it over to Diane. Diane, over to you.
Thank you very much, Khalil, and thank you to the Aga Khan Foundation for hosting us today. We always really appreciate the partnership that we have, and we found these conversations so stimulating, and it's so great to see so many people present and so many people joining us through webcast. I think we have a really rare opportunity today to discuss a very important topic with wonderful partners and really important partners. You each bring something very different to our discussion, and I think that we will use the time for some of the questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience so people can also ask you their specific question. I won't go through in terms of some of the statistics. I think Khalil has done it, Parliamentary Secretary Brown has done it as well. I think we'll jump right into some of the questions. What we're trying to hope to accomplish today is to learn from our discussion based on their experience and the advice that they can share with us. I would say 4 key areas. One is how education can actually make a difference in the development of a country. What are some of the challenges in conflict-affected and fragile states? What are the best programming tools that we have? And I would say the last one and the toughest one is how can we do better in the future? So we have seen some improvements, but we all know we need to make a difference. I will start maybe my first question with Mr. Ghalib. As we heard, like Afghanistan has seen tremendous progress in the enrollments of children in school, and Canada has been very pleased to be a partner with the government of Afghanistan to see these results. Can you tell us why education is so important to your government and to the people of Afghanistan, and how have you been able to prioritize education as part of all the development priorities that you have to deal with? Why did you make it such an important priority?
Well, thank you very much. Before I attend to your question, on behalf of the Embassy of Afghanistan in Ottawa, I wish to seize this moment to express profound gratitude to the Global Partnership for Education and also the Aga Khan Foundation, Canada, for co-hosting this important meeting this afternoon. And now to the question as to why education is important to the people of Afghanistan. As many of us continue to recall the history, it was over a decade ago when the Taliban imposed a virtual reign of terror on the people of Afghanistan. And in which education happened to be bearing the brunt of the repressive, anachronistic policies by the Taliban governed by their overall obscurantism. Now, millions of people as a result, particularly girls, were denied the God-given right to education. And also, as many boys were kept off the school because of insecurity, poverty, and others, among other factors. Now, it is precisely against this backdrop that we should define the importance of education to the people of Afghanistan. Now, no question that the importance of education is immeasurable in any part of the world, and including my country, Afghanistan. Education constitutes, I believe, the most vital tool of unlocking individuals' potentials, essential to further develop the evolution of mankind. And although given what I said before, education, find a whole new meaning and importance, particularly to people who have been at the center stage of all those, calamitous things that took their right away to get an education. but considering the fact that based on statistics provided by the United Nations, over 60% of the population of Afghanistan are made up of young girls and boys of under 30 years of age. They have a job to do in dealing with education and acquiring education in a country that is bound to somewhat overwhelming challenges of reconstruction, rehabilitation, and democratization and development.
Thank you very much. Alice, first of all, welcome to Ottawa. We're really pleased to see you here in your new role with the Global Partnership on Education. We've heard about why it's so important for Afghanistan. You are helping lots and lots of countries. How do you convince government to invest in education? And can you tell us the role that the Global Partnership on Education plays in terms of, I mean, we were talking earlier, it's way more than a financing mechanism. So can you maybe just tell us about the contribution you make to this as well?
Yes, and let me again add my word of thanks to the Aga Khan Canada Foundation. Thank you so much for welcoming us and having this event. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I also want to, we've had terrific time together today. It's an honor to meet you, Madam Undersecretary, and it's terrific to see you. Before I answer the question, I just want to really congratulate your government. Whoops, this is coming off. Congratulate your government, and in particular your minister, for the work that they're doing, because it's truly heroic. I've had a pleasure to be in Kabul, and I've spent a lot of time with your government. I think there's really a couple of answers to the question about how do we convince governments to invest. First of all, we have to think about education as an investment in a country's future, not as a recurring cost. And think about it in a much more longer-term perspective. If we invest in children in a society, we enable them to be productive members of a society. We enable them to take care of their children better. We enable them to get jobs. We may enable them to understand why going into a pathway of violence is not a good idea. And so we have to really get people to think about education in a very different way than just simply a budget line that is a recurring cost every year. And there's all kinds of data that proves this. One number that I like in particular is that if we teach all of the children in the poor countries that we work with to read, that will reduce the likelihood of extreme poverty by 12%. So it will have a huge impact on these countries. So it's by no means a peripheral matter, and that's something that I think if you think about how important it is to read, write, and do math, many things that we take for granted in some of our countries, to the lives that we all lead, you can understand why education is important. One example that I like to think about is in the health space where I used to work, and we all know that when you get a vaccine, you have a little yellow card, and that yellow card records the number of vaccines that you've had and the dates which you have the vaccine and when you have to get the next one. And if you can't read that card, then you can't use it. And you don't know that DTP3 comes after DTP1 if you can't do math. And so it's just a very small example of how being educated really enables a far wider set of positive impacts. And that's why when we talk to governments, both donor governments as well as our developing country partner governments, why we make such a strong and we think convincing case about why governments should invest in education. About the GPE, and I've had the pleasure of working there now for a little over a year. Gosh, I'm struggling with this thing. Hope you can hear me. There really are a number of dimensions to our work. One piece of it is we very much are a financing tool, but we also, and this is perhaps in some ways more profound, we bring together every major player that there is in the education space. We have all the major donors. We have representatives from 60 countries with whom we work, including the minister from Afghanistan. And we also have every other major partner that is there that we work with. We work very closely with UNICEF, and we're very pleased about that. Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much. I apologize for that. So we bring together all the UN agencies, the private sector, civil society. We have the teachers on our board. I mean, they're very much part of the solution. And so we have a platform we can bring together the state of the art in education and package that up in a way to translate that and give ideas to our minister friends for them to solve the problems that they have. So I've been in a number of meetings where I've watched this happen. So for example, I was in a meeting in New York in September where I was meeting with the education leadership from the government of Myanmar, brand new people in their jobs, and the sitting Vice Minister of Education of Korea, who's a friend of ours, was explaining to them about how he begins to teach teachers in that country and how they've begun to resource the education sector in Korea and how they've been doing it sort of for decades. And the gentlemen from Myanmar were taking copious notes. So there are multiple examples like that where I can point to where we can really use the world's leaders in education to be role models and help move along and help encourage and inspire countries who are earlier on in their journey. So it's a really, really interesting part of our work.
Thank you, Alice. Dave, as Alice mentioned, UNICEF is also a key partner in terms of education. She was talking in terms of how we make sure it's not a recurrent cost, it's not a silo. How does UNICEF, because you do have quite a vast area of work from protection to health, how do you make sure that education is integrated and bring the synergies of everything else that UNICEF does?
Well, because our mandate with UNICEF is the protection and promotion of children's rights, as children are growing, education is such a key part of that. So it touches every aspect of their lives. So when we look at our programming and we look at the 18 years, from 0 to 18 years of a child and a youth's life, we see that education is extremely important through that. So we're pushing our programming that's age appropriate and making sure that education is something that is covered. Because when it isn't covered, the impact and the result is so terrible for what can happen to those children. Parliamentary Secretary Brown mentioned No Lost Generation and what we're trying to do in raising awareness of what's happening in Syria. A few months ago, I was in Iraq at one of the refugee camps, and there meeting people, seeing our programs, and one little girl who just stayed in my mind because she was 11 years old, and we were looking at different things. We had a book there, and I said to her, because I couldn't understand it, I said, what is this? And she couldn't answer me, and she said, through the interpreter, she said, I used to know how to read, but I haven't been at school for 3 years. I don't know how to read. What does that mean for that little girl? And that's happening time and time and time again. That's why we're so passionate about No Lost Generation, about what we have to do, making the awareness of making a difference to children in Syria. But it's why education is so important to everything that UNICEF does, because 3 years in some of our lives, well, that's just 3 years. For that little girl, it was a third of her life. She's been at war, she's just known war, and a time when she's developing has been lost. That's what we have to fight against.
That's very interesting, because they say that the funding for education in emergencies is at an all-time low of 1.4%. And I think that Tony Lake was quite ambitious when he launched the No Lost Generation, especially with the title. I think people can identify. So if we look at this, because it is, there's the issue, and what has been interesting is all the humanitarian partners has been saying it shouldn't be do we feed them or do we educate them. We should do it all, right? But what's at stake, really? So if the funding doesn't come, and I'm really pleased that Prime Minister Harper announced 50 million, so Canada will be one of the leaders in this initiative, but what's at stake 10 years from now for these children?
We had, for all of those children, if they're without education, and Syria was a literate urban country, then it means you're having to start again. Almost, I think, and it means it's not just education, right? It's all the terrible things that have been happening to those children have seen in their lives. But education at least starts to give us a path forward and a path out of there. If there's no path out, if all you know is disruption, and you don't have some of the basic tools, I don't want to answer your question, Diane. I don't want to say what's going to happen in 10 or 15 years because I don't want to contemplate it. I just want to work towards making sure that we get something better.
Great. Alice, how can an organization like GPE help in this situation?
Well, just to maybe touch on the question just now is that one of the things that I think when you think about in terms of education in emergencies, if we don't act, you can see that violent situations are going to breed the continuation of violent situations. And one of the long-term roles of education is beginning to teach people that there are other ways to interact. And so I do think at a very macro level that education has a huge role to play in long-term stability.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what we can do about this, I think there's some structural issues and then there's some issues to do with the tools. I do sense that there's a bit of a disconnect between the humanitarian space and the development space, and education falls a little bit through that crack, not a little, a lot. The humanitarian space is a terrific space. I think they do terrific work. They don't tend to think of education as being an immediate humanitarian need. And one can understand that. You know, those needs tend to be blankets and water and food and tents and so forth, and those are very important. The development space, you know, there is a long-term planning space. And so what we see in situations like the Central African Republic, for example, is that you have to act quickly. So you need two things. First of all, you need to bring people together and come up with a transitional plan. And we are actually in the Central African Republic working with many of our partners. We pulled all the partners together at the eruption of the issues there, and we put in place a transitional plan to find the partners that we could to continue providing education. I think one of the key words here is continuity. Continuity of a presence of people to provide education, continuity of money, and continuity of what I would call the tools, the planning tools. And then we do need, I think, special financing tools. GPE right now provides money in sort of 3- and 4-year planning chunks. One thing that we're looking at, and we're going to take this to our board in June, is whether or not we need a special financing mechanism that can allow us to act more rapidly. Right now we can provide little amounts of money more rapidly, and did so in the Central African Republic. But I wonder if we need something that's a bit more rapid to match the planning tool that we have. And so, a couple thoughts. First of all, I do think there's a gap. And so we have to act and figure out, well, how we fill the gap. And I think the gap is a plan and a way of providing some money for continuity.
Thank you. Mr. Ghalib, Afghanistan has faced many security challenges. How do you ensure the safety and security of children going to school? And Alice was talking about education helps to promote security and stability. Do you find that it is helping in Afghanistan also building peace and...
Well, I believe education is a powerful force for transformation. And can have immense and far-reaching impact on improving health, to advancing gender equality, and promoting democratic participations, all of which are deemed to be the essential determinants and the enablers of peace in any society. So obviously Afghanistan is not an exception to this. I think over the years, over a decade, as much as this area was one of the distressing examples worldwide, the situation, education in the country, but we have a long way, and there are tangible, palpable, huge improvements made for everybody to see. The fact that Secretary referred to something based on statistics from Afghanistan, that we started off by a minimal or negligible number of kids attending a school, under 800,000, and now we're talking about more than 10 million people going to schools, and close to 41% of them girls. That obviously speaks volumes. So I find it's just not only it's literally a prerequisite for peace. I believe there is a proportional ratio between the war and fighting in education. The more people get education, the more shrunk space for the insurgency to thrive and to find currency in assert clout. And we've seen signs of that in parts of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, there are certain pockets of territory within the country where remains still hard hit by insurgency, where has resulted in a lack of access for the locals to go to school. And unfortunately, there you are facing or dealing with a part of the population who are totally gripped by despair. And a fertile ground for those who want to misuse or abuse their potentials, to put it in a different way. Examples of people detonating themselves and going to commit suicides and all that. Those are the people that unfortunately have been hard hit by this gloomy situation where they have had no access to education as a right.
Just to build on that, Alice, Mr. Gilley mentioned the importance of girls in school, and we know that it can have so many other positive impact on a whole range of other issues. So how do we keep girls in school, and how do we make sure that not just keeping them in school, but that they learn and then they can be productive citizens afterwards? What does GPE do to promote that?
Well, it's a very, very important area of our work, and I completely agree with you. I mean, you think about the positive effects on a society who educate girls. It's really it's a very important set of stories to understand. They will take better care of their children. They will get married later. They will have fewer children. They are more likely to get a job. They will educate their children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a few things that you can do. First of all, at the sort of upstream policy formation part of the process with the country, we need to remind, and the Ministry of Education in Afghanistan needs no reminder. They are an example of this. We need to remind governments about why it's important to educate girls, and I think increasingly many of the governments that we work with understand that. But we need to remind people about that, because people may not be aware of the data and the evidence around this, and the evidence is quite powerful. But then there are what I would call sort of infrastructure issues that are a challenge. First of all, if school buildings are either not dense enough or they don't have the right bathroom facilities for girls, girls aren't going to go. If girls have to walk too far, there are security issues and girls aren't going to go to school. So we have to understand those issues and try to cater for those issues. We have to train teachers to understand why it's important to educate girls. So there's a training aspect to it. There's also, I think, a community awareness piece of it. We have to work with some of the local civil society and community organizations to remind families why they should be sending girls to school, because a lot of families can make the decision to keep girls at home, working and so forth, and not educating them, particularly if there happens to be a choice between sending the girl or the boy. And then the other thing that I think we have to work on is really encouraging the government to provide equal opportunities so that families aren't in a position of having to pay for school themselves, so that they have to choose between the girl or the boy. So you can see that there's sort of a really kind of a multi-range sort of set of solutions to it, but it's something that is it's absolutely essential to it, and it has to run all the way through from how you finance it, how you advocate for it, how you establish sort of policy drivers for it. We've just announced decided at our board 2 days ago a new funding model at GPE, and one of the things that it's going to really stress is equity, but not just equity sort of at a high level. What does that mean? And for us, one of the things it means is girls. So our funding model is going to promote educating girls.
Very good. David, what does UNICEF do? And Alice was talking about all these things, and that points to we need to be able to measure the results, right? So we need to know what are we trying to achieve and how do we measure whether we have achieved it. So how does UNICEF work just to make sure that those learning outcomes are achieved, that girls actually are learning in schools?
When we're working together with governments, because like GPE, we're working very closely with governments and with ministries of education, it is looking at the results that will come through learning outcomes. It's not, well, as Khalil said, it's not the hardware. You know, you can see a school sometimes, you can see a building. It's the software that makes the difference. So we can be measuring the students' outcomes, but it's also, how is teacher training taking place? What kind of structure is being put in place, and what are we seeing happening with those teachers? Are they going to be teaching in a way that truly encourages learning for the children who are attending school? I think we've all seen times when schools have been built and nothing's happening in it. Sometimes there's really nothing happening, and sometimes they're just empty. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen, and that's by making those investments in the system, starting from the national plans to, as I say, through teacher training and trying to understand the children's learning outcomes.
Mr. Galib, is there any best practices, lessons learned from Afghanistan that you would like to share that could be applied to other countries affected by conflict or fragile states?
Well, providing education to the people is an essential part of responsibility by any state in a government. But in a situation, in our situation, as one among fragile and conflict-affected states, things are different. And particularly for Afghanistan, given that gloomy past, and the fact that a lingering insurgency and a somewhat low-intensity fighting has never gone away. Unfortunately, that has taken a huge toll on the ability of the government to provide resources and come up with services, as well as the ability to move around and try to, secure areas where you could erect structures to accommodate homes, and beside that, to have people readily, to send their kids to school. But having said that, the one lesson that I think is an important one that I find it worth recommending would be this somewhat global solidarity and based on a long-held consensus that it is not something that it's not only service delivery, but it is something that takes place, and where the government and institutions not in place or unable to do it for legitimate reasons, then I think it's the international community's ethical and practical obligation to come to the rescue and to help. Afghanistan has enjoyed tremendous support and help from the international community, particularly Canada, for which we all remain indebted and grateful. But nonetheless, this is not a mere instance. This is an evolution. This is a process that goes from a generation to generation, and that's why it requires sustained commitment and a genuine and bona fide will on the part of our partners and international NGOs and governments to make this an area of focus, to keep in hands-on approach towards education in the country. Obviously, this is not something to ask for an indefinite, open-ended, demand but we believe the more the achievements are made and the more strides are made, eventually the country would reach to a point that would start, reaping the benefits. And as I said, in our population, I do have something from the ministry that it talks about, things as I think it shows just that a defunct and neglected education system of 2001, which was providing poor quality education to less than 1 million students with no girls, to a progressive, responsive, and inclusive education system of today that serves 10.5 million Afghan children in youth, with 41% of them girls. So it tells us that, you know, as long as help is there, and there are certain, you know, practical frameworks in place and checks and balances to be focused to do the job, and to have people with passion and commitment on the ground to be involved in pursuing this very God-given basic right to every, I mean, human being, will hopefully get the good results.
Thank you. Alice, you've been working in many fragile states countries. What are some of the best practices that you'd like to share with the group here?
Well, fragile states are certainly a challenge, and I think the first thing we have to remember about fragile states, and I've now been to 3 of them. I've been to South Sudan. I was in DRC a couple of weeks ago, and I was in Afghanistan over the summertime. I think the most important thing to start with is that when situations in a country begin to deteriorate, the international community can't leave, and the people who are working on education can't leave, because the stakes around that decision are too high. We've talked about the importance of continuity, and we've talked about the long-term damage. I think the second thing that we have to then bring is bring everybody who is there who can be helpful to the table. Often, and we all know this, at the global level, there's often turfiness that kicks in between a lot of the international organizations. One of the things that I've observed in my travel, and it's really quite heartening, is a lack of turfiness in the ground. I've come away from a number of the countries thinking, you know, these people are working really closely together with the government that's there, and that's actually really good. So I would applaud all of the people who are doing that. Your colleagues in particular, I've been with in a couple of places, I just think are superb. Then I think we have to think about crawl, walk, run. And the first thing we've got to work on is just opening schools and finding teachers and training teachers. In South Sudan, training teachers is a real challenge. We spent a lot of time in South Sudan with BRAC, and they are training teachers. It's a very hands-on, sort of labor-intensive process. They go to the schools every day. They have lesson plans. But that's really the first step, and then the teachers will become better and better at their job. They will train others. They will have people reading. So I think you have to just really sort of, I think, deconstruct it into basic steps. We have to work on the finance side of it. It is a woefully underfunded area of our work. We've talked about the 1.4%. We again need to think about that problem differently, because the cost of ignoring this problem is going to just escalate year after year if we don't get at it. But I think that the most important thing, in terms of best practices, I would say is, and it sounds trite, but I've seen it in practice, is working together and continuity. I think those are the bottom lines.
Okay. David, and we're almost at the end now of our time before going to the audience, but maybe before going, looking 10 years ahead, what do you see some of the key opportunities? And maybe I'll ask the 3 panelists if they want to add something on that question. What are the key opportunities, key challenges? What do we need to do differently to actually make a difference? We were talking earlier this morning about the game changers, right? So what do we need to do, all of us?
One of the things I think that as we have our discussion about the next set of Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, we have to be sure that education stays in there. I think even if we haven't hit all the goals, they helped focus the mind, and I think putting in issues of quality of education, moving up beyond 100% primary, moving into secondary, and making those goals, because that does start to bring us all together. I think it's part of what stops the turfiness, is when there are shared goals. And I think that in the next 10, 15 years from now, we have some goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, about quality education into secondary that will be met. There are many different ways to do it that depend on the context, but that's a way to pull us all together globally and have a common goal in those.
Mr. Galib?
I would lay an emphasis on continuity and durability and diligence commitment, sustainability, and a faith in the fact that this will pays off, and this is not something confined or something exclusive to one particular society or a person, but rather it involves long-term implications and repercussions that eventually all of us would be on the receiving end of it. So that's why it's, again, it's important to maintain a hands-on approach towards it.
Okay. Alice?
I think if I was to point to one game changer, I would say it's the real shift to learning outcomes. I've been very interested in my work so far and my travels to understand the education space. I've often wondered why there is voluminous information available about and data available about children enrollment. I'd call it enrollment-related data. You know, how many children are in school, children who move from one level to the other. And then when you start looking at the other things that we worry about, learning outcomes, equity, quality, there's not that much data. And I think it's a classic example of what you aren't measuring, you can't manage. Okay, so I think that we've come to realize as a space that learning outcomes are what's really going to drive progress here. What we now need to invest in is the tools to define learning outcomes. There's the Learning Metrics Task Force, which I think many of you all are aware of. It's a great task force that has identified what does it mean to learn across many domains. Lots of people and countries have contributed to it. It defines both what I would call hard skills and soft skills. They are now defining actual indicators around that. The next step is going to be investing in data capabilities to measure those things. And in fact, one of the things that our board just decided on was a specific investment strategy to promote baseline, collection of baseline data around learning outcomes. That's big. It sounds very techno, but it is big. And so we will now start having the tools, and lots of countries have the ambition around learning outcomes. And I think that as a space, we're at a tipping point on that one. And if we can get that right, that will be a game changer.
And then you tie that in, I think, to things like the Sustainable Development Goals or whatever, as some of the indicators, and that's a way to support that as it goes forward.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I think that's our cue to move to the audience. I would invite people to, is there a microphone? I'm looking for the microphones. Okay, so maybe if you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Could you introduce yourself, say who you are and who you're directing your question to? There's another one after there.
Hello, I'm Barbara MacDonald-Moore. Recently with the Canadian Teachers Federation, have retired, and also with CETA. And my point is that in fragile and conflict-affected states, it's often not only the children you have to watch for a missed generation, but also the parents and the teachers. And to talk about teacher training, I think we also have to realize that part of the safety at school is carrying over the actual harassment and violence that takes place, particularly in rural schools in many parts of the world, in which girls go in to reach their dream and end up in a nightmare of sex for marks and kind of harassment and various things. So I don't know where that fits in the whole scheme of things, but I think for all the programs, the education quality and the software has to really reach into that understanding and commitment.
Somebody want to answer that question, or one of our panelists? Comment on this? I mean, I think we agree.
I think we would all very much agree with that.
Okay, somebody at the front?
Cynthia Blair, Chairperson, Canadian Future Achievers at Carleton University. And I'm smiling away because that's exactly what I was going to be asking about. I did not hear the word parents in the whole presentation. And perhaps you could take a few minutes to tell us, how do you relate to parents? How do you reach the children and achieve this element of sustainability and continuity without going through the parents?
I can answer that. I've now been in a couple of places where I've had the pleasure of meeting with what we would call in the United States the equivalent of the Parent-Teacher Association, but it's really the Parent Association. And when I first started traveling, I wasn't sure if these organizations existed in these countries. I thought it was just kind of an American thing. But I was just delighted to see how activist the parents are in some of the communities that I visited. And you're absolutely right. And I think that one of the things the global community can do is to work very actively with civil society in the countries that we work, which often include parent organizations, and encourage them to stay active, I think for a couple of reasons. First of all, to send their kids every day to school and inspire them, but also they are a terrific point of accountability for governments, because if governments aren't doing the right thing, then you want civil society, and who knows best than an annoyed parent that their kid isn't being taught, to stand up and say, my kid isn't learning, you know, let's do something about this. So parents are essential parts of the equation.
And parents are also, I've seen in what I'd call parent-teacher associations as well. I remember one group in Port-au-Prince in Haiti when it had been, this was around 2008 or 7, when it was a neighborhood that had been taken over by the gangs in Port-au-Prince, and the kids couldn't go to school anymore because it was too dangerous there, and the parents it was the parents in the neighborhood who wanted their children to be able to go to school that started negotiating with the gangs when they had that interest, both for the safety, but also just the daily safety, but also so that their children could go to school. So they became a very strong, it was a government school with almost no money, but they did have some teachers there, and the parents made sure. So it's not, they weren't just annoyed parents because it wasn't good. They wanted to get their children to school. So I think that parents as peacemakers are very important. And then in another group that when I worked with Save the Children, I remember I think it was in Burkina Faso, people talking about first-generation learners. It's an interesting thing because if the parents have not gone to school, because there's a revolution going on with many children going to school whose parents didn't go to school. So there is a need to work with the parents to show that it is worthwhile for their children to go to school too. So that's a whole other component, I think, of grassroots community development that has to happen as well.
Thank you. Do we have other question? Somebody there?
Yeah, hi. My name's Don Sutherland. I'm a public health doctor, but in my naive days in Africa, when I was a QSO volunteer, the president of Tanzania made a statement that really stopped me in my tracks, because I had been brought up with the idea that in Africa, people were uneducated. And he said, you say we Africans are uneducated, but we actually are educating our children for the life that they need to lead in Africa. And so my question is about content. Obviously, education has to move with what's happening and what's needed. So to what extent are you paying attention to the content of the education?
Let me just touch on that briefly, and I'll turn over to David. We are very devoted to putting the countries in the driver's seat and letting them determine their curriculum, what languages they want to teach in, and how they go about the content piece of it. I think we would feel very uncomfortable as an organization dictating, you must teach that, you can't teach this, and that kind of thing. And the reason for that is that we think that over the long term, that having the countries really feeling responsible and having a vested interest and feeling like this is a pathway to their future is really what's going to be sustainable over time. So I think we would feel quite uncomfortable pushing must teach this, must teach that.
And I think that we've all been in places where, I can think of places in Anglophone Africa where they're still using a British system and all, and that's not at all what we would be wanting to encourage. It is the same, it's that local awareness is really important. And it can, maybe it's trite, but to me, an issue of content and violence and emergencies, was being in a refugee camp where we were running some child-friendly spaces, we call them, they're sort of some early kindergarten stuff, and they had coloring books. So it's learning some basic things, and it was all about mines awareness, landmines, right? Because there were landmines around the camp. So you have these coloring books, and they were learning about landmines, not for some academic, because they had to, right? No, it's not trite. It's a simple example that needs to be expanded upon, that we want to be sure that it's relevant to the local context.
That's a question over there.
My name is Jan Hatcher-Roberts, and I co-direct the WHO Collaborating Center on Knowledge Translation for Health Equity. So I'm very interested in your comments, Alice, in terms of where equity fits in terms of the education space. And I think there's a lot of cross-pollination that can take place in terms of the equity effectiveness work and the tools and the methodologies that have been really very strong in the health sector area and the education sector area and health equity impact assessments, etc., and how that equity lens could be used in terms of some of the tools for the education area. It's very fascinating.
I think there's actually a lot of crossover between health and education, and I used to work in the global health, in the immunization space. There's obviously much more to global health than that, but that's an important piece of it. But I think that one thing I often think about from the health space is the notion of herd immunity, which is that you're creating with an immunization, an effective one, you're sort of protecting an entire society for bad things if you get above a certain level. And even though obviously the mechanics are different, I often think about education as having the same sort of global public service, in this case, effect about what you can do for society. So I think about equity in those terms. But UNICEF, I think, given how broad-based they are, have an even sort of deeper understanding of how you actually achieve some of those things.
But it's also, one of the things you had talked about, you'd mentioned, I think it was the crack between development and humanitarianism. I think it's bigger than a crack. But one of the things about education that we can't gloss over, that sometimes we may want to, is the issue of curriculum, because it's highly political in a way that, whose story is being told when you're doing social studies? Whose point of view is it? What are you starting to learn? And I just think that's a greater challenge for us, as opposed to when I've worked more on the health side. I think that's a bigger. In that, yeah, I mean, good, I'm glad you said, I didn't want to say it was easier on the health side, but there's something that's a bit more straightforward, both because of education being, you've got this longer view as a child is growing older, and then it can be political. And I was involved in a project where, on the border between Colombia and Ecuador, where teachers were getting assassinated because of what they were saying. It was an area where the FARC was coming in and out of, and so it's highly politicized in a way that we have to be aware of. I don't know the answer. You do. You got the. But it is. We just have to. We got to. That's what we've got to work with.
But it is very different. I mean, the only example in the health space, the piece of it that I know about that's kind of similar is the reaction in some countries to immunizing for polio. Like we see that in Nigeria. Yeah. But other than that, at least I can't remember much of those types of reactions. But in education, you're really talking about how do you define a country's past? Yeah. How do you define a country's future? One thing that's been brought to my attention, which is kind of a mind-boggling problem, is language. Some people will tell you, who are really experts on how do you learn how to read, is that you ought to read in your local language first, because reading is very attached to hearing. So you have to hear, you have to learn how to read in terms of what you hear at home. And then you should translate, you might want to move on to a language, more of a global language like Arabic or French or English or Spanish or something. So for some countries, I think Papua New Guinea is an example where they have hundreds of languages, local languages. How do you contend with that problem when you're publishing textbooks? I mean, it becomes not just a sort of a sovereignty identity question, but it becomes a sort of execution question. Like, how do you publish textbooks in hundreds of languages and get them out to all different places? It's very, very challenging.
Yes.
I just want to backtrack a bit to add a few words to the question you raised about the content. It's based on the experience that we have had in Afghanistan. As I mentioned, we had this phenomena of the Taliban, and when they ordered all the girls' schools shut down, they turned to the boys to go to school, but they came up with their own brand and fashion of curriculum that was totally dedicated and devoted to, it was called a religious madrasa, and it was totally religiosity. Something that was obviously neither the demand of the time and nor there was a passion for people to learn from it. Basically, there's nothing to be offered to a modern 21st century person to know. And unfortunately, that has lingered even now to pockets of territory where the Taliban has some, evasive presence. And still they argue that if the population, still maintain that yearning for education, these are the madrasas where we provide that curriculum and for them to learn. But obviously it all comes down and boils down to the content as to what they are offering for those young girls and boys to learn. And that's why we came drastically opposed to the whole idea, insisting on the fact that there has to be an official nationwide education system with modern curriculum to offer a whole variety of modern science and technology and arts and others.
Do we have a question from the web?
Hi. Here's a question from the webcast. To what extent do you think peace education and conflict resolution should be incorporated into curriculum being taught in fragile states?
To what extent should peace education and conflict resolution be taught in conflict-affected fragile states?
Well, I think we've just heard from our friend from Afghanistan. I think a good example of that. I mean, I do think it's important to get the government really to weigh in on the curriculum that they would like to have. I think that's very, very important. That said, education can be a very powerful force for peace. So I think it's a very complicated question.
I think I'm sorry, I'm just remembering places I've been, but I remember being up in the Swat Valley in northern Pakistan after the floods a few years ago, but it had been held by the Taliban for a while before that, and driving up there with a colleague who was saying, and we'd drive by these black destroyed buildings, and he would be saying, that was a boys' school, that was a girls' school, that was a boys' school. It was like driving, from Montreal to Gatineau along there, and just in every town, the school had been blown up, and he was so incensed, and just felt, we are trying to build peace here, and that's not what they're after. So I think that sense of content, as you said, we need local content, but it's got to be, if schools are getting blown up by people who are trying to fight still, it's because schools can be places of peace. There's a reason why they get targeted when you're any side in a conflict, because they are a place that can be used to build peace.
Maybe time for a last question.
Thank you very much for your discussion today. My name is Candace Holt. I'm in the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development in the development stream. And my question is about education kind of in the broader context. So in your work, what level of attention is given to opportunities for children after school and kind of integrating education and facilitating that transition to actually have an impact.
Who will take the question?
You mean not like after school I'm sorry, so the transition into work. I think certainly for us at UNICEF, while our primary focus is on primary, sorry, but there is a growing awareness that we have to, as primary education becomes more stabilized in more countries, we're starting to look at then what comes next and reaching into early secondary. We need to do, frankly, I think at UNICEF, we're not doing a good enough job yet at how do you make that transition, how do you work into livelihoods. We have to look at it in some different ways of that. As young people or as children are turning into adolescence and they're going to have more say in what they want to do too, it's empowering them, but it's then looking into livelihoods as well. And it's something for us that we're still learning in places. We need to do better.
I'll just add to that just one thing. We work in primary and lower secondary, but I think something we need to remember is sort of how much sense it makes to have kind of a holistic approach to education and look at primary, secondary, and tertiary. We don't specifically focus on tertiary, but some organizations, governments that I talk to are sort of at the edge of making a trade-off decision about whether or not they're going to support primary/secondary or tertiary. And we would encourage them to really rethink that, because good education systems need both. In order to be, to really come out of the end of tertiary school to be ready for the workplace, you have to start tertiary knowing how to read, write, and do math. But in order to prepare people for the workplace, you do have to go to tertiary or vocational in some situations, or whatever it might be. So I would encourage looking at them as sort of a set of stair steps up to a final moment of graduating, rather than do I support one or the other.
I think that takes our panel to a close. I think it's obvious from the discussion that we had today that everybody that is in this room agrees that education is actually investing in the future of a country and a society. And there's just a few takeaways that I'd like to leave you with. I think what I'm hearing from our panelists is we need to be ambitious. We can't just continue as is. We need to be ambitious. We need to protect children. That came out during the discussion. That there is a great potential to make a difference, but only if we work together and there's true partnership among all the players. I think we really heard that sustained commitment, that continuity needs to be there if we want to make a difference. That we also need to shift to the learning outcomes, and we need to measure what we do, because it's only when we measure it that we'll actually know if we have succeeded. And I think that one of our goals should be making sure that education is one of the goals in post-2015. So I would like to invite you to join me in thanking our panelists for their great contribution.
Yeah. Thanks, Jen.
Well, Diane, thank you very much. I promised you skilled moderation, and you got skilled and knowledgeable moderation, so even better than expected. Diane, thank you very much. And to our panelists, thank you all for your thoughtful commentary on what is a very wide range of issues that we covered today. I think it has spurred us all on to continue to think about these issues, but actually to also program in these issues and to mobilize both the financial and the intellectual resources to actually get things done on these issues. So I'm really very, very glad to have had you all encouraging us along. I want to thank the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development for their collaboration on this event and on other things we are doing here. I wanted to also let you know that the Parliamentary Secretary referred to a collaboration we have in Afghanistan on girls' education. I understand there's a brief for the girls' education program on the table behind that talks about the work that starts right at early childhood development, which of course is a major priority for the AKDN, right through to the employability issues that I think Candace raised in the question. So please do pick up a brief on your way out, and there are a number of other materials at the back. You will get an evaluation form online. So please do look for it, and we take that feedback very seriously. So I do hope that you'll take a few minutes to give us your frank and candid assessment of this event, and to invite you all on March 20th to an extraordinary event, which is entitled Please Use Responsibly Journalism as a Tool for Development, which will be held in partnership with Journalists for Human Rights here on March 20th at 6 p.m. So I hope you'll all join us for that. And if you're not getting our invitations, please let someone on your way out know, and we'll get you on our invitation list. Once again, thank you very, very much to the panelists and to all of you for allowing us to have such a productive discussion. Good evening.